Salvete. My name is Emily Debenham. I have degrees in Latin and history teaching. I also love to write. I recently published my novel Rogue of Taurus, a Roman-themed alternative historical fantasy. Links to my work can be found in my bio. I am excited to teach you about world building with Latin today. During the course of this lecture, I will introduce you to several Latin quotes, discuss what world building is exactly, and consider some of the basic world building questions you need to begin, and introduce you to the historical reach of the Latin language. Omnium rerum principia parva sunt. The beginning of all things are small. I thought this quote would be pertinent on our journey of learning today. You may not know a lot about Latin or world building yet, but rest assured that all writers and creatives start somewhere. I hope you carry this affirmation with you as you build whatever it is you want to create. Indeed, pause and take note, because this will be part of our quiz at the end of the lecture. Now, at this point, you may be asking yourself, what is world building? World building is one of the skills of storytelling, where you craft a world for your reader in a way in which they feel like they are actually in the world. It is a good skill to have for writing historical fiction, fantasy, sci-fi, and similar genres. Basically, any stories that are written with the intent to help people escape. We will review some basic questions and discuss some examples that will help you with world building, specifically with Latin. The first question we will ask is, when does your story take place? Latin was spoken primarily in the classical era, but continued to be an influential language for another 1,000 years. As time passed, Latin changed, so it's important to determine what time period your story takes place in. This is one of the most basic but important questions that you can ask yourself about your story. It determines a lot of things about your character, their experiences, and their world. For example, let's pretend we are going to set a story in the classical era just around the time that Rome was going to be founded. Our character would be exposed to Latin, which is obviously what the Romans spoke, but at that time the Romans were also surrounded by Italic tribes, so you would have had Oscan spoken by the Samnites. Etruscan was spoken by the very prominent and powerful Etruscan kingdom at that time. Greek was also a very prominent language and culture. So in this early time period, we have identified 4 languages that our characters can speak and learn: Latin, Oscan, Etruscan, and Greek. There are also more options like Umbrian and Falsican. But often with world building, it's better to narrow your focus. In later Roman eras, these languages had all died out. Indeed, Claudius, the 4th Roman emperor, was the last Roman we know of that studied or knew Etruscan at all, and he was considered strange on account of it. So take a moment and decide which time period you'll set your story and write it down. Dem tene verba sequentur. Grasp the subject, the words will follow. I feel like this can be so applicable to writing. Usually, if I'm having trouble with my writing, I need to sit down and figure out what I'm doing. World building is such an essential part of that writing process because it helps us to know where we are and what we are doing. And one of the best ways to figure that out is to ask ourselves questions. What languages are present in my world? We must ask ourselves what languages our characters will be exposed to. Then narrow that down further to what languages does my character have access to and experience with. So while you may compile a list of 8 languages, you may only have 2 that you need to pay any attention to in your story, because our fictional world is always seen through the point of view of our characters. Next question. What is the status of those languages? So for an example, at the founding of Rome, Latin was not the top dog of the languages. The Romans had to earn that. Greek was the top dog language in the classical era. So people would want to learn Greek if they were considered educated and powerful. But the most prominent culture closest to the Romans was the Etruscans. So you can have a character that wants to learn Etruscan because that is who they want to do business with. The Etruscans are the most economically powerful in that area for that era. So if they are really into business, they want to learn the language that will give them the most economic opportunities. In contrast, if a character wanted to be considered intellectual, they would learn Greek. Greek would also teach them the science of oratory and rhetoric. So if they were a lawyer or politician, that would be a helpful language for those goals. Another helpful question to ask ourselves is, what are the spheres of my language? So this relates to how and where languages would be used. Latin was used for about 2,500 years throughout Europe. The Romans spread their language across Europe as they expanded their empire. It eventually replaced native languages as the primary tongue of communication. However, after the Roman Empire fell, public and private uses of Latin withered and died. Latin was used in the business marketplace until it wasn't anymore. Latin was used in church until churches changed their policies. Latin was used for government administration and court proceedings until the laws changed. Latin held on in the sciences the longest: botany, medicine, and mathematics. So identify in what spheres Latin is still used in your time period. Our next slide will help us identify those. Here is a very general outline of how Latin was used over the centuries. Obviously, Europe is an entire continent, and each community and country had their own timelines for using Latin. So there may be exceptions within these broad ranges. Latin seemed to die out faster in Britain than it did in places like Italy. Starting in the Middle Ages, Latin became more of a written language than a living language. By the middle of the early modern era, Latin was pretty much gone except for informal education and church settings. Latin was still important to access information needed to succeed in scientific careers. But at present era, Latin is no longer needed to study advanced sciences. Latin is used for church services only on special occasions. There is still an enthusiastic classics community, and the Vatican still greatly values Latin, but no longer requires all clergy to learn Latin as they used to. So take a moment to study the chart above and take note of the general status of Latin in the time period your story takes place. Now, it occurs to me that we need to clarify some of the symbols on this chart in order for you to interpret it. So the check marks are for Latin was used in common use in those areas during that era. The white arrow that points down means that Latin was in a transition state where it was becoming less use and people were beginning to use their own native languages in favor of Latin. And under the religion column, there are some boxes, some eras that have a yes, it was used, and a blue X, which means Latin was not in use except for probably in exceptional circumstances. And I have it that way because the Reformation happened. And so Protestant religions, in keeping with that era, with that thing, they wanted to make themselves distinct from the Catholic Church. And so they stopped using Latin, but also their goal was to be more available to people, more understandable, more kind of democratic type of a thing. And so they used their native languages. So the Martin Luther, one of his primary goals was to translate the Bible in German, the language that his people spoke, instead of using the Latin Bible. So that is why in the religion column it is both in use, because the Catholic Church continues to be dedicated to using Latin, and it's used in the services, and the priests are required to speak it and use it. But at that time, because of the Reformation, Protestant sects stop using Latin. And that is why. Nil tam difficile est quin quaerendo investigare possit. Nothing is so difficult but that it may be found out by seeking. Terence. So, we've covered a lot of ground in this video. We've covered centuries of time with only the broadest of strokes. I hope you are not overwhelmed and that you will press onward knowing that with study and effort you can skillfully incorporate Latin into your story. Now, to give you some context for how to incorporate Latin into your story, I'm going to talk about how Latin changed throughout the different eras. And we'll begin with the Latin of the classical era. And this is going to be a very brief, but a little bit more detailed instruction. So scholars in general agree that the Latin of the classical era can be separated into 4 categories. There is Old Latin, Golden Latin, Silver Latin, and Late Latin. Old Latin is the dialect spoken before the classical era all the way up to the age of Cicero, which was the late Roman Republic. Some authors in the Old Latin era wrote up to the standards of Golden Era Latin, and so are considered part of the canon of Golden Era Classical Latin. All right, and to clarify, Golden Age Latin is considered classical Latin from a teaching standpoint. It is the form of Latin taught in language classes today, and it was the aspiration of many medieval authors and teachers. Silver Latin is the cultural product of imperial rule, and it is considered more ornamental, very technically beautiful, but a little bit less soulless. It has a little bit less soul to it. Under the rule of emperors, freedom of expression was curtailed, and Latin lost some of its spirited flavor that we see in the Republican era. All right, late Latin is the product of a Christian Rome trying to rule an expansive and complex empire. Latin becomes a simplified lingua franca, and incorporates new vocabulary to explain Christian concepts and church governance. It is the red-headed stepchild that no one wants to claim. It's not really classical, but it's not really medieval yet either. It's late antiquity, a short bridge that exhales the death of one era and inhales the dawning of a new epoch. So, some things you need to know about the Latin of the classical era. So the most influential era of Latin literature is the Golden Era. The Golden Era started in the late Republic. The ultimate prose writer was Cicero. He wrote in multiple genres and innovated in areas that other Roman writers hadn't attempted before. This era was also a time of huge political conflict. At the end of this era, Augusta had seized power and essentially destroyed the Republic. So the Golden Era holds two distinct branches of literature. The first, Republican era prose that sought to defend the ideals and traditions of ancient Roman government, and the second branch, referred to as the Augustan era, cultivated by Augustus himself, that reimagined the history of Rome to fulfill its ultimate destiny as an empire ruled by a divine lineage. This era produced Roman literature's finest poets, like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid. Right. The Latin of the Middle Ages, as I said before, has several periods. Scholars don't agree on when classical Latin ended and when medieval Latin started. There is a late Latin era where the necessities of ruling a Christian state required new vocabulary and new thematic compositions. About 2 centuries into the Middle Ages, it became clear that people no longer really understood late Latin. Now, you have to understand that people probably still considered themselves as speaking Latin. They probably had no idea how far they had drifted from classical Latin. They still considered themselves Latin speakers to some extent. Obviously, there became a point in the Middle Ages where they could no longer convince themselves that they spoke the Latin of the Romans. This process happens across Europe slowly but irreversibly. There are attempts to retrench back to classical Latin. This does not work in the long run, and by the end of the Middle Ages, people are speaking in their native tongues distinct from Latin. Yet, they are only being taught to read and write in Latin. Latin is no longer a living language, but it is the universal written language of Europe. It is quite impressive how well Latin scholars in the Middle Ages mastered the science of second language acquisition. We look back and ask ourselves how they did it. They applied the linguistic skills they inherited from Latin scholarship to their own vernacular languages and began to compose literature in their native languages: French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. When discussing the Latin of the early modern era, we need to discuss the one invention that divides the Middle Ages from modern society: the printing press. It cannot be exaggerated how it changed everything. The first works printed on this press were the Vulgate Bible and Donatus's Ars Minor, a Latin grammar book. Suddenly, Latin grammars were being printed left and right, as well as Latin texts that were previously only available to church clerks and scholars. Educated men hunted the libraries, monasteries, and cloisters of Europe for any manuscripts of Latin authors and published them. This era is flooded with printed Latin. I can just imagine some Latin enthusiasts cheering, finally, it's going to happen. Everyone's going to speak Latin again. Before, the books were hidden away. Now we have them. Nothing can stop us. Obviously, we're not speaking Latin, so it didn't happen that way. But people were so excited. And this started the Renaissance. Now, these humanists from the Renaissance get a little bit hoity-toity with their Latin. They looked back on medieval Latin and decided it was not up to standard. So they decided to change that. They were very strict about standardizing grammar and spelling, which was not a bad thing, but they all had to agree by which standard to judge their Latin. And so they decided on the Golden Era Latin. They emphasized the works of Cicero and Virgil in particular. This worship of Cicero got a little out of hand when they started arguing that you couldn't use any vocabulary that Cicero hadn't used. So sometimes this movement got a little bit ridiculous, but they did manage to make their stylistic changes. I believe it made Latin more approachable because it became more standardized. And this is how we came to embrace Neo-Latin. So Neo-Latin was the fruit of the Renaissance Latin. We standardized Latin spelling and grammar and decided to give up the ridiculous notions about only using words that Cicero himself used. There are efforts to incorporate vocabulary for modern concepts and inventions into the Latin language. The Vatican publishes a standardized dictionary of Latin terms that most scholars and linguists are happy to consider the authority on standardized modern vocabulary. There is more debate on pronunciation than on grammar and spelling, as those two debates have already produced a more generalized consensus. Eventually, two systems appear, the two pronunciations systems appear, the classical pronunciation and the ecclesiastical pronunciation. The classical system attempts to reproduce the historical pronunciation of Latin as the Romans would have spoken it. Ecclesiastical Latin is favored by those who use it because it sounds more similar to English and other Romance languages. So, because it is pronounced in a more similar way to the Romance languages, it helps people to learn and retain the vocabulary easier. So, yeah. And we come to Latin of the present era. I think the most interesting thing about contemporary Latin in comparison with previous eras is how it is affected by modern technology and research. Linguistic research reveals that the best way to cultivate literacy in any language is through speech. This presents Latin students with the obstacle of finding communities to practice Latin. Teachers have pivoted from the traditional grammar models of education to inductive reading methods. Modern communication platforms have made Latin communication easier than previous decades. The internet has also made Latin text more accessible to millions of students. Technology has also provided the modern student with powerful study tools like digital dictionaries, collections, and libraries, making the study of Latin more accessible, more affordable, and more time efficient than in any other previous era. All right, we have come to the end of our first lesson. Thank you so much for joining me. We went over some of the most general questions about world building with Latin. At this point, you should have decided what time period your story takes place in: classical, medieval, early modern, or contemporary. I hope you recorded what languages you want to highlight in your novel, what the status of those languages were, and finally, in what spheres those languages were found. We reviewed a brief summary and history of Latin in each time period. We also learned 3 Latin quotes. Remember to review these quotes for your quiz. Oh, and then I wanted to leave you with a book recommendation. If you are interested in learning more about how Latin changed over the centuries, I would recommend Ad Infinitum by Nicholas Osler. And in particular, it has a really good section on medieval education. And it's just fascinating. I learned so many things, and I learned a lot of Latin I hadn't encountered before. So, highly recommended for additional study. Thank you. See you next lecture.